Good morning. My name is Katarla, and I'm live at the CGIAR booth at COP23 with Alex De Pinto, who is a senior research fellow at IFPRI. So Alex, tell me a bit about the research that you're working on.
Most of my research, if not all, is on climate change. From an economic perspective, since I'm an economist, an environmental economist. And a lot of my work lately has been sort of centered on climate-smart agriculture and the economic aspects of climate-smart agriculture.
Okay. So you recently participated in an IFPRI seminar where you talked about climate-smart agriculture. Can you tell us what it is and what it aims to do?
Yes, that's not an easy question, and there are many different interpretations of climate-smart agriculture. I mean, the interpretation and the original formulation is pretty clear. It's based on 3 pillars: increasing sustainably productivity, increasing resilience and capacity to adapt to climate change, and reduce emissions when possible. But how that translates into sort of the practicalities, that gets a little more complicated. And unfortunately, generally, it boils down to identifying a series of practices that farmers can adopt in the field and from which they can choose, and that's climate-smart agriculture.
Okay.
And that is, I believe, contrary to the original intent, which is not so prescriptive, but rather trying to find, whenever you think about agricultural development, about some particular goals, think about the 3 pillars at the same time, and think about the trade-offs.
Right.
So it's more like an approach, a way of thinking, a framework of thinking about agricultural development that has to face climate change, rather than a prescriptive way of doing agriculture.
Okay. Interesting. So can you tell us about a success story that you've had with?
Well, along these lines, and I think that actually this experience I'm going to discuss now has informed a lot of my thinking. It's based on what we did in Colombia in 2015, and actually the reason it's a success story is because it really contributed to the INDC, the intended nationally determined contribution document that Colombia submitted at COP 21 in Paris, and then was ratified a year later and became the national determined contribution. And in particular, we demonstrated that it was possible with open data, with models that are not easy to learn, but if you put enough time, you can learn how to use them, and they're openly, because we produce public goods, so
right.
We shouldn't forget that. We demonstrated that it was possible to determine the kind of investments and the type of work you could do on several different policies, and see which one of them would actually deliver in terms of economic growth and reduction of emissions. And in particular, we showed that an attention to livestock and pasture land in relationship with forests, that was the best the possible best outcome in terms of policy attention and policy focus for the government of Colombia. Initially, they thought they didn't have enough capacity and enough data to do that, but we demonstrated actually it was possible, and they trusted us, and we worked very closely with the university there, with CCAFs there. We worked with the government of Colombia, and it was a wonderful sort of relationship between scientists, policymakers, decision makers, and it worked. This is an example in which science really informed policy making. It doesn't happen that often. I hope it will happen again, but that is my best example of a success story. And again, is this broader outlook, not just focusing on production, not just focusing on forests and reduction of emissions, not just focusing on increasing adaptation capacity, but rather keeping it sort of broad and have the possibility of comparing different outcomes when you shift focus on one pillar of climate-smart agriculture rather than another. And that informs policymakers in a way that then they make their own choices according to the goals that a particular government, a particular country might have.
Wow, that's really great. So you're participating in a couple side events this week. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yes, I presented yesterday on one that it's a recent piece of work that we finished, and it's on the interface again between agriculture and forests, and in particular this idea that in order to promote restoration of degraded soils and degraded forests, actually you have to include agriculture in the mix. You can't just think about forest restoration. You can't just think about sort of restoring degraded soils if you don't pay also attention to what happens to agriculture. This is because most countries are actually concerned about food security, and that is one of their primary objectives. Therefore, combining restoration activities with a clear understanding of what is possible in order to promote restoration while you also promote increasing productivity, that becomes a vehicle to sort of possibly to have a wider uptake of restoration efforts, which is a big challenge because we have been thinking about restoration for decades now, but there hasn't been that much progress, as much progress as probably there should be.
Okay, so then what do you expect to be the outcome for agriculture at COP?
Well, I think that most of us who work on agriculture are here with the clear intent of making sure that agriculture is taken into account in the negotiations that happen in those rooms where we normally don't have access to. It's almost like a little bit of a trickle down in the sense that if we achieve a critical mass sufficient to make sure that agriculture, food security stays in the discourse, it will be taken into consideration in the negotiations. Because right now, agriculture per se, the word agriculture does not appear in the Paris Agreement, for instance. Although all the documents, the nationally determined contributions, most of them actually mention agriculture as one of the main areas in which countries need to focus as they deliver on emission reductions. So agriculture is present in the country's intents and in their plans. It's still, we believe, not present enough in the official documents, and then they come out of COP. And so our voice here probably plays that role of making sure that agriculture receives the due attention.
Oh, okay. And so then the last question, what is your hope for the outcome of these meetings?
I would have to, having said the importance of agriculture, and let's say that we're successful in our goal of making sure that agriculture is sufficiently mentioned in all negotiations, the most important need at this point is to find the right methods to implement the Paris Agreement, which means that the tools, the data, the modeling that is behind what countries have promised is scrutinized, and some general understanding of how this can be done globally sort of can be developed so that countries can compare their own emission reductions and exert that kind of pressure that we think, since the Paris Agreement is voluntary, so you need to have some sort of peer review type of process, but a peer review type of process presumes that you have some common basis in terms of data and methods, and also to verify what you have been doing during this time. So that is right now the most pressing need, I think, and so if we at the end of COP have developed at least some steps towards harmonizing all these different parts for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, that would be a success.
Great, thank you very much. It would be very interesting to see what the outcomes end up being, and hopefully someone hears you. Thank you for joining us live at the CGIAR booth at COP23.